Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Quirk.
First, I'd just like to compliment Dr. Collins on an excellent answer to that question. It's one I get asked fairly often, and I'll now have more detail, and I really appreciate it. For Dr. Greenblatt, so you've assumed something about a model for how heating and cooling is changed in buildings. My concern there is that we know that the models that are used by, say, PG&E, they go out, they test. There's now a state study looking at the whole house, advanced program. It gets less than 15% of what they calculate. So my question here is, when you looked at energy conservation, were you using models other than that? Because otherwise you're overestimating the effect by about a factor of 7, at least on the heating and cooling part.
So we found it very difficult, I should start by saying, to get definitive, references for how much efficiency improvement you could get for residential and commercial buildings. So it's not like some of these other policies, such as vehicle efficiency, where there have been extensive studies done of the increased, as a function of cost, and you can put your finger and say, yes, we can get this, and it's EPA-tested numbers. Of course, real-world fuel efficiency always varies from that as well. But what we did do is we have found, and we need to do more research on this, we have found a small number of studies that look at the whole home retrofit space and ask how much efficiency savings are various building owners able to get given a certain amount of investment with a reasonable payback. And the latest data that we have shows that you can get roughly a 50% increase in efficiency savings in a residential building with a payback time which is short compared to the life of a mortgage. It's more than 10 years, but it's not infinite.
Okay, but do take a look at this study, because it's saying that it's more than a 50% effect, at least in California. Now, we're talking about climate across the country, it's one thing, but in California, because of our relatively mild weather, it seems to be there's a 50% effect, I know, in Michigan, for example, on these models. The feeling is that it's more like a 85% effect here in California. So I recommend it's a PUC study, and I'll email it to you later.
Thank you. I look forward to reading it. And my concern here is not only that we can overestimate those effects, and not all of them, of course, for refrigeration or lighting. I think the numbers are quite good. But then there's a question. We're looking at SBS 350, 50% reduction in fuel, 50% in building use, and going to an RPS of 50%. The question is economically that the best way to do it? And I have concerns, of course, because of the building modeling. But if we were to correct that, I think we would want to take a look at economically what's the cheapest way to get there. And I know there have been a lot of studies done on that, but I think we have to correct the work that's been done on energy conservation before we really know that. Where do you see, in terms of the modeling, not only yours but others, about being able to come up with an answer to that might be useful to us? We'll probably be looking at the final passage of this bill in August, and it would be very good to have good academic studies, particularly if they correct the building part of it, to sort of guide our legislation. It could be something that would make a difference in real time. Yes, thank you for setting us a deadline for that. So as I think you're already aware, there are a few of my colleagues in the state who have looked at the economics of making these various policy implementation. That includes the Group E3, includes the UC Davis research group.
And it's possible, perhaps in a short time, for us to add some economic estimates to the policies that we've already modeled, which, of course, I neglected to say did not have any economics included in the accounting here, but a price tag could be added, could be estimated and added to many of these implementations.
Yeah. So the problem with the E3 study is they only looked at a few scenarios, and so although they made a cost estimate, which you can argue about how accurate it was, certainly again didn't take into account these building effects. They really didn't try to optimize it, and we need to look at it. And I believe it's the UC Davis model that looks at an optimization. I think there's another Berkeley model that does as well. And if you can get this in real time, I think it would be very useful. If you can correct.
Okay.
Thanks.
We'll do our best. Thank you.
Mr. Stone, followed by Mr. Williams.
Thank you. Much of what you're talking about and much of the policy that we've done over the last number of years is around mitigating, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. But what we really haven't touched on, and I think some of your strategies here in potential policy areas also help us in the way of adapting to the changes that we know are coming already and building more resilience for California. So touch on that. What are some of the intersections there? And there's some things up there, for example, the reconversion of pasture land to forest. They touch on land use. And I think we have a lot of land use policy areas that we need to look at more strictly here in California, affecting both local and statewide interests, in order to build a more resilient California in how we protect, as well as dealing with the water supply, protecting watersheds, protecting estuaries, and the systems that have been our natural buffers. So what have either of you done looking at ways that we can be mitigating, but also ensuring that we're adapting in appropriate directions for the future California?
We're playing catch the hot potato. Do you want to take that first?
Sure. So I have some colleagues at the lab who have looked at the impacts of climate change on our energy system, which points the way toward potential, resilience-enhancing activities. I mean, some of the things that I think Bill didn't have time to talk about were the hotter temperatures, which can affect power plant efficiency, which obviously would affect air conditioning loads. It also affects the amount of energy that we can move over our transmission lines, because those are dependent on the ambient temperature and winds and so on. And then on the sea level rise side, there's great concern, since so much of our state lies in low elevation areas, the kinds of infrastructure protections that we have to make, which I think that has less of an effect on energy use, but the first few that I mentioned definitely do. And so there is work that has been done in the area to at least identify how bad of a problem it can be. Now the next step would be then to develop a portfolio that includes mitigating some of those effects and how that overall affects the policies. But I want to turn it to Bill if he has.
Well, because I noticed, for example, you've got some distributed generation policy that on your slides, and it represents one of the smaller categories of change. But from combining looking at adaptation as well as mitigation, I think if you add those factors in, do we start to see a little different picture?
Well, I think I would hesitate to say exactly what we would see. I think that definitely needs to be done. I mean, it's harder to do these kinds of models where you're taking into account the climate changes as well, because it's hard enough to predict sort of just just standard projections of energy use and vehicle use. But absolutely, it needs to be done, and it should be done. And I think that you'll be seeing some work in that in the next couple of years. Because I know there's an EPIC call out, for instance, that is looking at some of these effects.
Well, I think one issue we haven't touched on today that could be a bit of a joker in the deck is sea level rise. For a couple of reasons. This is one of those issues where there are black swan events that could represent quite stressing events for parts of the coastline. And it actually does come up in the context of water, because you so often see major water treatment facilities at basically low elevations because they're being gravity fed, right? So you're feeding water into a water treatment plant or something that's close to shoreline, because that's where it's being fed from communities or industries uphill. The estimates of sea level rise between the fourth assessment report, on which I was also lead author, and the fifth assessment report increased by a factor of 3. So they went from 30 centimeters, because we didn't include land glaciers and ice sheet decline, to a meter, a sort of central estimate. But that meter is what we call a fat tail distribution. So it has a long tail that goes to much higher impacts, and the upper bound on that was about 2 meters, so 6 feet by 2100. This is this intersects both this issue around adaptation and what communities are going to do, but also intersects with the water system. And it's been, I will say, this is perhaps a sidebar to your immediate question, but it's been interesting trying to discuss with communities around the Bay Area how they plan to address this. And the challenge that we face, I think, which may get into some other issues, is that the shoreline of the Bay system, if I'm not mistaken, is about 500 linear miles, with about 150 different agencies and other entities that govern that shoreline. How you come up with, and this is just, I'm not being parochial, but how you deal with just that entity, the Bay Area, much less the rest of the coast of California, and come up with a consensus position around adaptation that logically deals with the issues of the intersection of communities, water, and governance, is one where I think we don't yet really have an adequate strategy for dealing with it, because it touches so many sectors. And so that's an area I just wanted to flag for this committee's consideration, where I think concerted action is required, and the appropriate mechanisms for that concerted action may not yet be in place.
No, I agree. I don't think they are, but that is something that I think there's a strong statewide interest in ensuring that local regions and local areas are on the right track, because the better we build in that resiliency, we also are mitigating some of those effects and having the systems that help us protect ourselves against the kinds of system changes that you're describing. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So we'll allow Mr. Williams to ask the last question. We do need to move on to our next panel, so I'll ask that the question hopefully be concise and the response as well.
Well, first of all, I want to say all of us are excited when any one of our own bills comes in the top 3 of your S2 or S3 scenarios. But one of those I have to ask a question about. You mentioned 758 plan, which I thought was a great bill. I thought you were real generous with your description of the plan. I at least found it to be not particularly helpful of how we actually reach it from a policy level, because it outlines sectors but not necessarily all the policy mechanisms to accomplish something like that. And so I guess a request along with Mr. Quirk's would be if there are further recommendations that were not specific enough in that plan to reach the goals of that plan.
I'll comment by saying I have not had time to review the plan in detail, and I plan to do so.
I'm not asking for it right now. It would just be something that would be helpful this year.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very, very much for a very interesting and informative set of presentations. I think you can tell we all appreciate your being here this morning, and ask if you can that you stick around through the next round of presentations, and then we'll have a little bit of time for roundtable discussion. Thank you. And so now I'd like to ask to step forward as I introduce you, Stuart Cohen, who's the co-founder and executive director of Transform, a powerful and effective voice for world-class transit and walkable communities in the Bay Area and beyond. We also have with us Michelle Passero, who is the Senior Climate Policy Advisor for the Nature Conservancy, the California chapter. She has over 15 years of experience working in land conservation and environmental law and policy. And finally, we welcome Strela Service, who joined the California Environmental and Justice Alliance in 2008 and now coordinates their climate and energy campaign work and oversees organizational development for the Alliance. Welcome to all of you. thank you for being here and participating in this panel on land use, environmental justice, and adaptation. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Bloom. Good morning, Assembly members and to the public. So my name is Stuart Cohen, and I'm here to talk about the transportation and land use components of the climate issues. I think, as you saw from the previous speaker, transportation is responsible for the largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And when you consider land use, which helps to generate how much electricity and water we use, transportation and land use really starts to encompass kind of a majority of our climate emissions. And so what I'd like to do is really do three quick parts. One is a little background on the issue and its importance, not just for climate, but for families, for health, for household costs, some strategies that can be implemented, and within the context of the cap and trade program especially, and then just a quick look at what some of the benefits might be statewide if we went down that path of really implementing well on this issue. And so starting kind of as background, we have a law, as you know, in 2008, SB 375 was passed. So the 18 largest regions in California now have regional plans to reduce the amount of driving that takes place. And those plans, though, are in great need of funding to be implemented and in need of kind of a nudge and a push because it's the local governments that are responsible for implementing them. And so as I get into my slides, I like to start with this one because this is really the kind of the future I like to pick. This is kids going to school supported by a Safe Routes to Schools program, which is a way to reduce the amount of traffic on our streets. 20% of trips in the morning are getting kids to school. If we could get them safely walking and biking, we're going to have healthier, more energetic kids and lower emissions and less traffic. And so there are some really great outcomes you can get when you start to think about what are the transportation and land use strategies. But let's start with kind of envisioning how this works. Well, when we talk about infill and smart growth, which is a lot of what we're talking about with SB 375, stopping to build on our open spaces and to the extent possible infill, it means taking places like this, San Leandro, somewhat more abundant downtown economy, not a great place to visit right now, but went through a planning process where they start to add in density. And in fact, they approved a plan to increase density of housing from 700 to 3,500 a couple of years ago. You add in things like urban forestry, which makes it a nicer place to be. And then you add in transit, you add in better walking, biking facilities, and some destinations. And what you start to get is a place that people are driving less, can walk to more destinations. And so not only new residents that move there, but existing residents now have more things close by. So Transform did an analysis of how much benefit are we currently getting in the Bay Area and the other major regions from good transit access and this kind of walkability. And what you find is that, and I've got these available, if you're near transit, this is breaking the Bay Area into quintiles. The yellow areas, the lightest areas, folks there are driving 42% less than in the further out areas and over 50% less than the deep red. But what we also found is that transportation costs per household vary dramatically with, again, the same folks that are living near transit in these walkable communities have much lower costs. And when we talked about, Assemblymember Stone, about resilience, economic resilience of our communities, we think is also very critical. So resilience in a few different ways. And this puts it onto a correlation of the quintiles. And we can see that as you get to higher transit access on the right, the amount of CO2 emitting goes down to 3.5 tons per household, down from 8 at the highest households, and costs go down significantly too. And this cost thing is important because when you're talking about spending your funds here on cap and trade for transportation and sustainable communities, which is getting a large part of the funds, what you're doing is leveraging individual households, allowing them to spend less. Because look at what public agencies spend in the Bay Area, $4.6 billion on our transportation infrastructure, but it's individuals that spend the lion's share of money. And so to the extent we're enabling less driving, we're really going to be enabling that. And when you look at this for the state, because we're spending over $100 billion a year out of our individual pockets, we could, if everybody had the same access as those 20% have, the 20% that have the best transit access, we could be reducing CO2 by 34% and having an annual savings for families of $31 billion cumulatively for the state. Now, low-income folks get hit the hardest. On the left is folks making $20,000 to $30,000 are spending 31% of their dollars, of their income dollars, on transportation expenses, because if you own a vehicle, it's about $8,000 per year. And so what we really need to do is create ways that folks can save money, but as we're reinvesting in infill, we're also realizing that with the demographics changing, more people wanting that, especially in hot markets, LA, Bay Area, displacement is starting to happen at a very extreme rate. Honestly, my employees are starting to get displaced because of the housing market in the Bay Area. And so the coalition I'm very involved with, Sustainable Communities for All, has really prioritized affordable housing as well as affordable transportation. And we did this report last year that shows how, if you look at the HUD income thresholds, low-income folks do own vehicles. This was kind of a myth. It's hard for people to understand why you can invest in affordable homes and how do you know they'll reduce their vehicle ownership. But this graph shows, even at all of the income thresholds, if you're living in the green, non-transit-oriented development areas, you're owning many more vehicles than in the half-mile near transit, which is the light green, or the quarter-mile near transit, which is the dark blue. And so even extremely low-income individuals reduce their vehicle ownership by about half when they move to transit. And so we think this is a critical reason that the plan should continue to invest in affordable homes near transit to maintain that income diversity. And of course, in terms of the vehicle miles traveled, it's also about a 50% reduction even for lower income folks. The previous speaker brought up ride sharing and new mobility. We think that's a critical component of how we're going to change. Believe it or not, vehicle miles traveled grew for 100 years straight. And about 9 years ago, it decoupled from economic growth. And we've seen a decrease in per capita driving by about 8% in the last 9 years. And so part of that is this revolution. A lot of people are sharing cars, and when it's not right in your driveway, but you have to walk a block, and you pay for it by the day, you're going to use it less. Things like giving out transit passes. This is a short-term strategy. This is something that we'd like to see, giving out transit passes. In a study that was done in the Bay Area, families that got these with their households gave up, 22% of them gave up vehicles. And so these are some of the strategies that could be considered that have short-term impact. To have long-term impact, the cap-and-trade dollars have to go beyond just giving out dollars. And there's a few key strategies that we think they need to have. One is to really support integrated strategies, right? So we should be supporting buildings that are affordable housing that's giving out transit passes, including car sharing, connecting with bike ped, and so that's one way, is just supporting model projects that are integrating. The second one is to really leverage these dollars for policy change. So really cities that have complete streets plans should get some priority in these dollars. And then finally, we want to kind of really get innovation in here. And I'll give you an example of how this happens, but we have a program called Green Trip that works with developers to reduce the amount of driving that's going to happen in their buildings. And so this development was going to have a $2.5 million parking garage. It was required. But instead, working with them to do things like including car sharing on site and bicycle parking and fix-it stations and a whole bunch of other amenities, they were able to get the city to convince the city to reduce the parking, eliminate it fully, as long as this suite of strategies, including car sharing on site, so there was always a vehicle available to them, And so not only does this mean that folks there will have lower transportation costs, they get free transit passes, they have car sharing instead of their own vehicles, but it means that $2.5 million in part went to build some more affordable units in this house, in these apartments. So finally, I want to pivot to kind of what can this do if we went statewide with this? Well, as some of you may know, there was a project called Urban Footprint. They're about to come out with a new analysis in 3 weeks, but this is their one from a few years ago. High-Speed Rail Authority and others interested, state agencies spent a couple of $1 million for this tool to look at the benefits of growing smarter. And so when you look at how the pink new growth that we're looking at on the left is the new growth expected by 2050, if we can shrink that down to take up less greenfield, we're going to have significant benefit. First of all, we'll have less of this, right? Our orchards going under for this kind of development. And that is the most direct and obvious benefit, is that will be less land consumed if we're doing more infill and less and less greenfield. This estimated, this was 2010 to 2050, but you could save up to over 3,000 square miles of land. Of course, you're going to reduce VMT. I already went over that, vehicle travel. But building energy goes down. More compact growth requires less energy. You share walls, you share ceilings. Residential water use goes down because compact growth has many fewer yards and other efficiencies. Infrastructure costs goes down because we're not continuing to spread out on roads we don't even have money to maintain. And then ongoing operation and maintenance costs go down for cities with, again, less infrastructure, including fire and police territory that have to be covered. I know many of you were local decision makers and had to confront some of these hard choices that are happening now. And then finally, there's things like health benefits, where we're going to clean up our air with all of these policies, get people active and moving again. And so this is just ending on this, funding transportation and land use, we can have some real short-term benefits by getting car share out there, by getting things like transit passes and bikes out there. But it's really when we start to integrate these strategies and reward model projects and reward model cities that we're going to see more of them coming down the pipe. And that's where cap and trade, by being new dollars that people don't already have their hands on for their next transit or road project, can incentivize those kind of integrated projects, and already is. The Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, which gets 20% of the funds, is already really striving for that. And we hope with good monitoring and measurement and good public stakeholder input, because there's a lot of great ideas out there, can become a really model project and model program for how this funding takes place. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. We'll queue up the next set of slides.